Hey everyone, RogueGold here, and at long last, it's finally time. Today I'm bringing you all the ultimate beginner's guide to the Conflict PvP mode in the Division 2. Ever since the mode received some substantial changes with the Year 5 Season 3 update earlier this year, that coming alongside some long-awaited tweaks and balancing made to PvP combat itself, there has not only been a drastic spike in interest for Conflict itself across the community, but also a huge increase in requests I receive from people asking about Conflict builds, tips, and just advice overall. So, that's my goal for today. By the time you're done with this video, you'll know everything there is to know about Conflict itself, how the mode works, what the ins and outs are. You should have a much better idea about what kinds of builds you might want to pursue, and hopefully you'll have a better grasp on what the overall tactics and tips are that you can try and employ in your own gameplay to improve your success rate. There are chapters for this guide down in the video description if you need them. We're going to cover everything from map and mode overviews to more detailed mechanics and recommendations, so skip around as needed. Let's not waste any more time though, as we've got a lot to get through. Only thing I'll say is that if this guide does end up helping you out, then leaving a like on the video would be incredibly appreciated, as that does significantly help me out. And if you want to see more of my stuff more often, stay up to date with the latest info and coverage on the Division 2, then be sure to click that subscribe button. Over 70% of y'all watching are not. I know, I can see you. But yeah, jokes aside, we'd love to have you. And without further ado, let's get into this. And to start, let us answer the core, most foundational question there is to ask. What is Conflict? Conflict is the Division 2's dedicated player versus player playlist. It features no NPCs or other dangers, just pure PvP action across a few various modes and maps. If you don't know where to find it in-game, you've got two options. The easiest is just to open your map, tab to the left, and you'll find the Conflict tab, where you can then click on the Quick Play playlist to begin matchmaking. Alternatively, you can also visit this NPC below the helicopter pad at the White House to access the same menu. Quick Play is the only playlist that Conflict offers. It bundles all modes and maps into one that you vote on before each match, so don't worry and think you're missing out on anything. Another key component that I wanted to answer near the top is, what are the rewards? Is Conflict worthwhile for me to invest my time into, or is it just for the fun of PvP? Well, after the game's latest major update, it's actually one of the most rewarding spots in the endgame. Each match can earn you anywhere from 1 to 3 shade levels worth of experience depending on your individual performance and what mode you're playing, on top of earning 1 to 3 Conflict caches per match. Those caches contain 2 items each, those both coming with stat rolls equivalent to playing legendary difficulty content, so very high rolled. And Conflict caches also have a relatively high chance to contain an exotic as a bonus item, at least compared to the other sources in the game. Okay, now that we got those top level things covered, let's get a bit more specific and kick things off with maps. The physical locations that Conflict takes place in. There are 5 dedicated and unique Conflict maps that the Division 2 has, and every different game mode within Conflict, which don't worry we'll cover, can each be played on any map. So it's at least somewhat important to have a basic understanding of how each map flows. First off, we've got Capital Ruins. You'll notice it has a very symmetrical layout, a pretty distinct 3-lane approach. This map features a lot of vegetation, it's overall very bright, and it favors more close-quarter engagements for the majority of spaces you go within it. Then we've got Stadium. Here's the top-down view. It can be tough to gauge elevation from these, but this map heavily revolves around a centralized rooftop location. If you control that space, you have a lot of control over the flow of the match. Similar to the last map, Stadium is also quite bright, fairly colorful, and it primarily focuses on close quarter but has some mid-range engagements as well. Then we've got Georgetown. Once again, here's the top down. This map can be played in a variety of locations. You can employ a lot of different tactics and flanks, but its most distinctive feature are the 2 opposing rooftops that overlook the middle of the map. Definitely a popular sniper's nest for many, but across the map, mid or long range encounters are definitely favored. Fort McNair is up next. Here's the top down. Once again, it's tough to gauge from this, but this map has a very unique descending layout. By that I mean, on the top side you've got some courtyards and a bridge connecting the 2 sides, and then as you move down, the elevation does as well, from a variety of driveways, stairways, ladders, and more. So it's an interesting blend. Also a lot of mid to long range fights here. Last up is Wharf, top down view here. Somewhat similar to Stadium, you've got a central rooftop towards the bottom there that holding onto will give you a lot of control over the match. But this map is much larger. You can also flank and fight in other locations. A lot of mid to long range fights here as well. Okay, with those down, let's now move on to the 3 distinct modes that are available within the Conflict umbrella. Each of these feature 4 players on each team. 8 is the total lobby size for Conflict. On top of that, there are many other commonalities between these modes like the respawn system, boosts, and more, but let's first cover the 3 core modes and how they differ. First up, you've got Skirmish. Skirmish is your pretty classic team deathmatch-like experience. Each team gets a pool of 16 respawns. Now that does not mean that you just need 16 kills to win the game. Rather, each team can use 16 total respawns, after which the depleted team just has 1 life left to try and stay in the fight. These respawns are also not reserved or evenly distributed between teammates. You could have a scenario where one teammate uses all 16 if they were to just go in and keep dying. Or if you're all playing as a team, then you're more likely to see the deaths evenly split. The way you win is simple. Deplete the enemy team's respawn pool and then wipe the team on their last life. Then we have Domination, again taking inspiration from some classic PvP mode setups. Once a domination match begins, 3 capture points will drop from the sky, with points A and C being located close to each team's spawn, while B lays right in the center of the map. To capture a point, you can either stand within its marked boundary for a steady possession, that speed will increase the more teammates you have in there, or you can go up and hold the interact prompt to claim it much faster. Just be warned that you are immobile while doing so, reducing your chances to be able to react to potential ambushes or snipes. You can track at the top of the screen which points are under which team's control. Blue means your team has it, red the enemy team, and if it's gray, that means it's neutral and earning no 1 points. Speaking of points, that is how you win a domination match. Your team needs to hit a 750 score cap, and you earn 1 point per second per capture area that you have under your control. So if you just have A, for example, you'll earn 1 point per second, whereas if you held A, B, and C, you'd get 3 points per second. And so this tug of war between capture points drive the conflict, no pun intended, of this mode. And then lastly, we have Team Elimination, your classic style elimination mode here. Each round you only have 1 life, there are no respawns. You win a round by wiping the enemy team, and the first team to win 4 rounds wins the match. It's a best of 7, pretty straightforward. So, now that we've established the maps and modes that you play on within Conflict, let's go over some of the rule sets and base mechanics that you'll encounter every time you play, regardless of what map or mode you're on. The first thing to be aware of is that one major change made to the experience recently was the Shade and Expertise normalization. When you enter into Conflict, all levels and bonuses associated with the SHD Watch and Expertise progression systems become temporarily disabled, meaning that the only stats that will separate you from other players while within the mode are your individual build roles and attributes. So, because of this, it is important to keep that in mind when setting up a build to take in there, right? Let's assume you're Overwatch level 1000 for example's sake, so you've got all of the bonuses from there. That means that upon entering Conflict, you will automatically lose 10% crit chance, 25% crit damage, 10% hazard protection, 10% status effects, etc, etc, you get my point. The same with expertise levels. If you rolled an extra blue core onto your build because you're getting 18% extra damage from expertise on your primary weapon, that 18% won't contribute while you're in Conflict, so adjust accordingly. Once a match begins, there's then some key things to be aware of. Firstly, we've got the Conflict gear lock. All this means is that you're only allowed to change your loadout or individual pieces of it once per respawn in spawn area. What that means is when a match begins and you're standing in your spawn zone, or when you die and respawn there, you can then go in and freely change loadouts, weapons, skills, whatever. But once you leave your spawn area, you're locked out. You can no longer swap things around. The same is true if you were to leave the spawn zone and then run back in there. You won't be able to change again until you die and respawn there. So plan accordingly and make sure that you have equipped what you want. Speaking of spawns, the spawning system within Conflict is a bit different than the ones you might be familiar with in other PvP experiences, and it's developed a not so great reputation both recently and in the past. Instead of spawning individually and in dynamic locations around the map upon death, Conflict operates on a 2-point spawn system. Each end of any given map has a dedicated spawn zone. These are the same ones that you begin each match within, and at any given time your team is designated one of those 2 zones. Conflict also doesn't do individually timed respawns. There is an ever-present clock ticking behind the scenes that determines when respawn waves will occur. This is why when you die, sometimes you'll only get a 5-second countdown before respawn as opposed to 15 to 20 seconds. The reason for this is because the mode tries to incentivize team play as much as possible, so it tries to bunch up every fallen teammate, spawn them all in at once at the same location, and send them on their way. The problem is that this system has been proved to be quite flawed over time. Spawn camping is unfortunately quite prevalent within Conflict, and there's not much to be done when it happens to you other than staying patient and waiting for the enemy team to get a bit too aggressive or too impatient, and they then make that one fatal move where you can then capitalize on it and finally get out of there. One key thing here is to know what a spawn flip sounds like. The game will play a very distinctive chime. and listening for that chime is the only way to know when a flip occurs, which in turn allows you to better approximate which direction enemies might be coming from next. Here is what that chime sounds like.
An agent needs assistance.
On a somewhat similar token, we have the mercy roll system. In essence, if the game determines that one team is just far superior and is beating down on the other a bit too hard, it will begin a mercy roll timer, and when it hits 0, the match will end regardless of how many lives are left, etc. In theory, this is to prevent losing teams from facing too hard of a time, but similar to the spawn system, it has proven to be a bit flawed. Sometimes it will start a mercy roll timer when the gap in lives isn't that significant, or conversely, if the losing team does close the gap by a good amount, sometimes the game just keeps it going anyway and ends the match. Once again, not much you can do about this, but it's good to know what it signifies so that you can try and play around it. Next up, we've got boosts. Boosts are a periodic thing that the announcer will call out. They appear in each of the 3 conflict modes, and they're denoted by this symbol that you'll see on your screen. If you're able to, you want to get these at all costs. In Skirmish and Domination, the 2 you'll collect are either a superior damage buff or a big chunk of bonus armor. Those apply to your entire team immediately upon boost pickup, and they can definitely swing the momentum of a fight or match. Elimination does feature some different and unique boosts, like a constant enemy pulse for the duration of the boost, or even a team-wide respawn for fallen allies. So regardless of the circumstances or mode that you're playing, try to keep these boosts out of enemy hands at all times. And at any time you're able to see who has a boost, which one, and for how long at the top of the screen under each player's icon. We then have Specialization ammo drops. Once again, you'll hear the announcer call these out when they're approaching. A chopper will fly overhead, parachuting out a shade crate, and claiming it will grant you and your entire team a small amount of ammo for your selected Specialization weapon. These, while still very valuable, are slightly less important than the boosts in my opinion, simply because not all spec weapons are overly powerful in PvP, and it requires great timing to properly utilize them given the limited ammo that you're given. One way that I determine how much priority I want to give to claiming the spec drop is seeing what specializations the enemy is running. The little icons at the top screen UI show you just that. If I see the enemy team has a lot of technicians or gunners, I'm not too worried. If they have demolitionists or sharpshooters, I'm a bit more concerned. But the one real threat is the firewall. With the flamethrower, you only need to land 7 ammo ticks on the enemy to catch them on fire, and if that happens to you, you're dead. In my years of playing, I think I've only seen someone escape the jaws of that once. So if the team you're facing is running 4 firewalls, then yeah, definitely try and grab the spec drop at all costs. Similarly, you can also see who in the game has spec ammo from the UI. If their icon is bright orange, that means they have specialization ammo ready and stored, so play accordingly. Okay, so those are all of the main mechanics and things to be aware of that are shared across all of the different conflict modes. There is one last thing I want to cover before we move on to builds, however, and it's less of a dedicated mechanic, rather it's actually one thing that conflict removes despite it being present in the rest of the game, and that is the radar. Yes, if you've played Conflict or watched footage of it, you might have noticed that trusty radar is nowhere to be found. And I think this is very significant because going all the way back to the Division 1, having your radar along with all of the other situational awareness tools the game offers has been core to the PvP experience. Division PvP has never much been about stealth or ambushes. I mean, half the time you can see your enemies through the walls as they approach. But Conflict isn't like that. And on top of there being no radar, they also significantly increase the base cooldown of the scanner pulse skill while you're in there, further complicating being able to effectively track your targets. The reason I bring all of this up is because I believe this one simple change does and should heavily influence how you play the mode. You can't waltz into an opening and be fully confident that no one is hiding behind the cover in front of you. You can't jump a fence and be sure that someone isn't going to pop out and shoot you while you're in the animation. Now, in case you do want to retain a pulsing ability of some kind, the remote pulse is one that I've seen get some popularity lately, and you can also equip Sharpshooter to gain access to the recon drone that provides a pretty consistent live feed of enemy locations. But regardless of those options, I just want you all to be aware of how the lack of a radar should influence how you play. For me, I try to pick up on audio cues way more. If I hear a drone buzzing out in front of me, I can be pretty certain that it's following behind an enemy. If I hear a few boot clamps or the dings of a ladder being climbed, don't ignore them. Those could be some of your only warning signs that an enemy is sneaking up on you. But I think the most important advice I can give you is just to slow your gameplay down by a little bit. Now, once you fully memorize each map, master spawn timings, and how long it takes to travel to various locations, as myself and many other dedicated PvP players have, then you can afford to be a bit more bold in your decision making. But if you're just starting out or you're trying to improve, take that corner cover, scan an environment you want to head into before running in there, wait and see if you can spot an enemy down the road. That stuff will make the difference, especially when more experienced opponents will use every trick they know to try and outsmart you. All right, and with all of that down, let us now move on to the topic of builds. Now, I feel like I have a bit of a different approach when it comes to build recommendations and selections in these kinds of guides. I think you'll find a lot of people out there who say this build is the very best for this content, or these 1 or 2 builds are factually better than anything else. And for the most part, I just don't agree, especially when it comes to PvP. And I say that because not only are there dozens of different viable build combinations that I can think of off the top of my head for this current meta that are popular to use, everybody has a different goal, a different role that they want to try and play. Who am I to say that this high damage AR build is the only way to go, when there's people out there who prefer to heal, prefer to snipe, prefer a million different things. So again, as with a lot of content guides that I do for this game, I highly encourage you to experiment and find out what kind of roles and builds best fit how you play the game. That said, there are some general principles that I think can be effective to follow when it comes to building for conflict specifically. One is armor. Unless you're making a build in which the purpose of it is to get right up in the enemy's face, I'm a pretty firm believer that conflict calls for you to run less armor than you might on a similar setup in the Dark Zone or PvE content. And that loops back around to what we were just talking about with the lack of a radar. Fueled by that mechanic, conflict is often much more about quick skirmishes instead of long drawn out battles, which would call for more survivability. And so because of that, it often proves to be more worthwhile to lean into things like damage over armor. For example, if I run a pretty standard AR build in the DZ, I would typically run 4 to 5 armor cores, whereas in conflict, I would generally sit around 3. And I'm actually probably in the minority. More often than not, you'll see people running around with all 6 reds. So just keep in mind that the conflict meta, if you will, is typically more squishy. Again, unless your build specializes in close quarter fights. And then I just wanted to remind you all once again, you will lose your SHD and expertise bonuses while you're playing within conflict. There's also unfortunately no easy way to preview that stat change when you're at the White House prepping for a build, so some math might be required, but just tune your stats accordingly to make sure that once you go into conflict, you're not missing out on something that you were banking on having. Now I know, I can hear you all through the screen right now. Really? You're not going to give us any build recommendations? Of course I am. I just wanted to first emphasize the importance of experimentation and creativity, as that has always been a big thing in the division. And even with the builds I'm about to show you, if you like their general framework but think you could tweak a few things to make them better fit your playstyle, do it. Far too often people blind copy builds and don't really take in what makes them work or properly align it with how they play. Don't make that mistake. There are 3 builds that I want to show you. These have been my most go-to loadouts ever since the latest major update and all of the new balancing efforts went into effect. So unless you're watching this way in the future and further changes have been made, I give you my seal of approval that these builds will serve you well, specifically if you're looking for a damage build. I am going to reiterate this as we go over each one, but just know that the links to the full dedicated video breakdowns that I've done for each of these builds is in the description below. The first is a pretty standard, well-balanced mid-range AR build. I would say that these are some of the most common and popular categories of builds to go for in the Division 2 PvP and conflict specifically, so I wanted to offer my own take on that. If we take a look at the build overview, the star of the show is the shield splinterer named F2000. You can also just use a regular F2000 if you don't have that one specifically, but with some staple high-end damage pieces and the companion damage talent on our backpack, this thing puts in work and is very reliable. I'll have a link in the top corner of your screen right now if you want to see the full breakdown, or like I mentioned, you can find it at any time down in the description. Next up is what I've dubbed the Heart Strike. It creates a pretty interesting blend by mixing Heartbreaker, which is traditionally an assault rifle gear set, with the Ouroboros exotic SMG. The reason the pairing works so well is because of how quickly the Ouroboros allows you to build up the bonus armor from the Heartbreaker talent, turning that around and making you far harder to kill while you melt enemies in the face. This is a look at the pieces. I want to mention off the bat that while the Ouroboros is absolutely the best option if you do have one, you can also swap out for a high-end Vector if you don't. But for the gear, for Heartbreaker, including the backpack, that's the key to grabbing so much bonus armor. The Catharsis is then one of my favorites for this style of play, and specifically in conflict, it's a great way to protect against status effects and other hazards. So yeah, this build works wonders. I love it. Again, the link will be in the top corner and down in the description at any point you may want it. And lastly, this is build number 3. No fancy name for this one, but this is my favorite Umbra loadout. Umbra has seen a big resurgence in these recent months, specifically since the conflict revamp, and I think that's partially because of how well it fits into how conflict plays with no radar. Build up your stacks, pop out and dish out huge amounts of burst damage. It's hard to beat. This is the overview. The Iron Lung is really great for its base stats, plus ignition capabilities really suppresses enemy fire. Beyond that, we've got Vigilance and the Coyote's Mask, both boosting our damage ceiling by quite a bit, and then 4 Umbra to take it home. Not too much else to say for it. I assume at least most of you get the gist of how Umbra works. I've got the link for the full breakdown on this one in the upper corner as we speak, and one final time, the link is also down in the description. That video actually shows off 2 bonus loadouts as well, so there you go. Happy early birthday. Alright, we covered the mechanics of conflict, we covered some build ideas. Now you're probably thinking, okay, but how do I win? How do I kill people? It's a valid question, one that I won't fully be able to answer. At the end of the day, PvP in any game is about practice. Prepare as much as you want, but ultimately you're just going to have to get in there and fall down a few times before things start to click. Same as riding a bike. That said, there are a few additional tips that I can give. For one, conflict caps out your armor kit carrying capacity to 2, and it only replenishes you 1 kit per respawn. So if you needed another reason to play a bit more cautiously than you might otherwise elsewhere in the game, there you go. You might run into situations where you really need to heal, but you can't. So use the kits that you get conservatively. Additionally, given how prevalent skills and skill-focused builds can be in conflict, it's a good idea to be aware of how the more recently implemented EMP system works against them. If you encounter players using tier 6 skills, whether it's stinger hives, mortar turrets, you name it, and you want to throw on a jammer pulse or an EMP sticky bomb to your tier 0 damage build to counteract them, it's not going to work. With the system in place, your EMP skills need to be within 3 skill tiers of the opposing skill to have any effect. So if you want to jam an enemy skill that has a skill tier anywhere between 0 and 3, then you're good to use a tier 0. But if you want to disrupt tier 6 skills, then you need to have a minimum of 3 skill tiers on your loadout. And this is why hybrid and support builds can be so good in group play. Also added with the latest major update for the game was the status effects rework in PvP, basically giving players more inherent ways to counter these hazards in gameplay. That includes the following. If you get set on fire, you can do repeated dodge rolls to build up some passive burn resistance. If you're bleeding, standing still gives you extra passive resistance. And specifically when you're in PvP, you're able to move while shocked, so be sure to do that as much as possible to avoid taking further damage. On each application of a healing skill, that means the charge of a chem launcher or the healing beam of a repair drone, you get a 50% hazard protection boost for 5 seconds. And let's say that you get put on a nasty bleed or burn, but the enemy player that applied it to you happens to go down within your vicinity. Well, when the source of a status that you have on you dies, that status will go away regardless of how much longer it had left. So even if it means hobbling over and hip firing them, be sure to finish off status wielding opponents. Okay, and the final thing that I wanted to cover and shout out in this guide is what I consider to be a highly complimentary video that I released just the other week. That being a commentary and analysis video on an intense conflict match I had. It's over 20 minutes long, and in there I pause, rewind, and specifically highlight what plays I made, why I made them, what my thought process was during these different moments. From the comments I've gotten on there, it seems to have helped out a good few people already. And if you yourself think that watching that sort of analytical review might help give you some extra knowledge or insight into how you approach conflict, then I highly encourage you check it out. As I will say for the final time in this video, the link for it is in the upper corner right now, and it will also be linked down in the description. Alright, my friends, and with that, I bring this guide to a close. I sincerely hope that you found this useful, or at the very least entertaining. I tried to deliver all of the important information that I think you need to know in as concise of a manner as I could. I'm sure there's still going to be lingering questions about some stuff, which is why I implore you to not only leave those questions below in the comments, but also for anyone listening who feels as though they have knowledge to share, leave that as well. I don't know everything, I'm not the best player in the world, and this is always a collaborative effort, so let's try and make it that way and help as many people as we can on their PvP journey. Once again, I sincerely hope you enjoyed and learned something. I wish you the very best of luck in your conflict journey, and who knows, maybe I'll see you in there. That is going to do it for me on this one though, everybody. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. RogueGold. Ow.